right, well, welcome to Victim of Communism Memorial Foundation's class on the Cold War. Today, my name is Ken Pope. I am the Director of Academic Programs for the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. It is my pleasure to introduce you to today's lecturer on the Cold War, Dr. Elizabeth Spaulding. Dr. Spalding is a senior fellow at Pepperdine University School of Public Policy. In addition to that posting, she also serves as our vice chairman of the board of trustees, and is also a core faculty member of VOC's National Seminar for Middle and High School Teachers. Dr. Spaulding is also the author of The Cold War, Harry Truman, Containment, and the Remaking of Liberal Internationalism. She's also the co-author of A Brief History of the Cold War, and is currently working on a history of the world communism. In addition to that, she's also helping me write a new curriculum on communism. So with no further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Spaulding.
Thank you, Ken. It is a pleasure to be with you and with you all, to be with Streamable Learning again and to talk about the Cold War today. So what is the Cold War? And I'd like to start with insights from Harry Truman, the president who first saw and identified the Cold War. I suppose that history will remember my term in office as the years when the Cold War began to overshadow our lives, Harry Truman said in his presidential farewell address of January 1953. I have had hardly a day in office that has not been dominated by this all-embracing struggle, this conflict between those who love freedom and those who would lead the world back into slavery and darkness. And always in the background, there has been the atomic bomb. Think on these words. They distill the essence of the Cold War and the derivative, political, existential problem posed by nuclear weapons. It's interesting to note that at first Truman resisted the use of the expression Cold War. The term was popularized in 1947 by America's premier political columnist at the time, Walter Lippmann. But Truman did not stick his head in the sand. He realized that the Cold War was thrust upon him, America, and the West. And he explained the conflict to his fellow Americans, decided what needed to be done, and presided over the crafting of what is arguably the most important foreign policy in the country's history. As the most significant statesman in the United States and among its allies at a critical time, Truman could have chosen differently. Not everything he did by any stretch was perfect, but he got the Cold War largely right, both in real time and as it turned out for the future. But when history says that my term of office saw the beginning of the Cold War, it will also say that in those 8 years, we have set the course that can win it. This is Truman continuing in his farewell address. We have succeeded in carving out a new set of policies to attain peace, positive policies, policies of world leadership, policies that express faith in other people, in other free people. We have averted World War III up to now, and we may already have succeeded in establishing the conditions which can keep that war from happening as far as man can see. The Cold War is a case study in not only arguably the most important foreign policy in American history, but also in presidential statesmanship in a time of unprecedented crisis. More on the Cold War. The Cold War was the most protracted conflict of modern times. It was also highly unconventional and different from previous conflicts. World War I and World War II were great, sweeping, hot wars that shaped our modern history and world, but the world wars did not match the length or the complexity of the ideological, strategic, political, economic, diplomatic, and moral struggle that occupied the superpowers, that is, the United States and the Soviet Union, as well as all other powers on every continent for over 40 years. The Cold War was waged on many fronts, from the United States to the USSR, from Europe to Asia, from Africa to Latin America, and by different forms of governments, liberal democracies, totalitarian communist regimes, and everything in between. It included grand strategy, public as well as secret diplomacy, economics, religion, and cultural exchanges and face-offs. There were hot shooting wars in Korea and Vietnam, in which the United States lost tens of thousands of active military personnel and dedicated civilians. There were also communist purges, imprisonments, torture, deportations, the Gulag, and man-made famines that killed millions upon millions of men, women, and children. At stake in the Cold War was the future of mankind, of each and every person, of each and every family, of each and every community. Would the world be dominated by the forces of communist totalitarianism led by the Soviet Union, or inspired by the principles of political and economic freedom embodied in the United States? If the aggressive expansionist drive of the USSR had not been contained, much, if not all, of Western Europe would have joined Eastern Europe in being forced into communism. This would have isolated the United States strategically, politically, and economically for the foreseeable future. Adding that in 1949, China also came under communist rule, the United States would then have faced powerful, hostile regimes to the east and to the west. It would not have had the same allies that it has to this day. It would not have been able to lead and contribute to what we call the liberal world order. The free world would have ceased to exist. The West and Western civilization would have ended. When World War II ended, the GIs came home and the American people expected a return to normalcy. That would have meant prioritizing domestic over foreign affairs. Most hoped that they could turn over the major responsibilities for international affairs to America's wartime allies and to the new United Nations organization. After all, the real global problems would be somewhere else on the map. But almost 6 debilitating years of world war had reduced Great Britain to a shadow of itself. And even though not all would see clearly at the end of World War II in 1945, the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, we go to slide 3, thank you, aimed to proceed with its grand design of communizing the world. As for the UN, it was both new and untested and quickly became a Cold War arena. There was no one to protect America, its interests, and its allies, but America itself. For over 4 decades and under 9 presidential administrations, Democratic as well as Republican, the United States pursued first a strategic policy of containment of the Soviet Union and communism, then a policy of détente and accommodation, and finally, a strategy of renewed containment to counter, pressure, and undermine what President Ronald Reagan called an evil empire. Today's world would be a far different place if the United States, at the cost of tens of thousands of lives and many billions of dollars, had not waged and won the Cold War. Now I'd like to talk with you about these 3 different stages of the Cold War. And the first stage is containment. Now, as with any great period in politics and history, the story includes what ifs. What if Franklin Roosevelt had died a few months earlier in 1945, and then Vice President Henry Wallace had become president? Wallace would have sought a marriage of democracy and communism. He thought the convergence of the two opposites was inevitable and even positive. Instead, we got Harry Truman. Truman came from Missouri. He knew farming and small business, and he held strong political and religious convictions. He was a student of history and an experienced US Senator. He believed in liberal democracy and the rule of law. As president, Truman looked at communist totalitarianism and Stalin's Marxist-Leninist ideology. He saw that the Red Army was staying put in the countries that it had liberated in World War II. He saw that the Soviets were violating wartime agreements and were imposing communist governments throughout Eastern Europe. By the time he sat on the stage listening to the one and only Winston Churchill, former British Prime Minister, giving his instantly famous remarks in 1946 in Fulton, Missouri, about the Iron Curtain, Truman had already concluded that the Cold War was a conflict between good and evil, freedom and tyranny, liberal democracy and totalitarianism, capitalism and communism, theism and atheism. At the beginning of America's involvement in the Cold War, Truman understood what we call the regime distinction. He saw what the Nazis did before and during World War II. He saw the devastation that was permitted by appeasement. He knew that Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. That before the Nazi Germany had invaded the Soviet Union, the two tyrannical states banded together to divide Europe between them. And then if that had worked, they would have gone on to divide the world between them. In the Cold War, Truman understood the lessons of history. He saw the power aspect of the Cold War. He knew that the Kremlin was able to advance because their Red Army was staying in the countries that they had liberated and were installing communist governments. But Truman also got the why part of Soviet behavior and actions because he grasped the role of ideology and that Stalin and his followers believed in communism, the one-party totalitarian regime, the abolition of private property and individual rights, and the crushing of family, community, and religious faiths as shaped over the course of millennia. Stalin and his followers not only believed in communism, but they also wanted to promote and spread what they saw as their inevitable truth globally. One of Truman's most important explanations of the East-West conflict is his 1947 speech before the US Congress, arguing for the Cold War strategy that would quickly bear his name. The whole Truman Doctrine speech is worth listening to on YouTube. The core message is Truman's Cold War assessment of the two ways of life. In his words, at the present moment in world history, nearly every nation must choose between alternative ways of life. The choice is too often not a free one. One way of life is based upon the will of the majority and is distinguished by free institutions, representative government, free elections, guarantees of individual liberty, freedom of speech and religion, and freedom from political oppression. The second way of life is based upon the will of a minority, forcibly imposed upon the majority. It relies upon terror and oppression, a controlled press and radio, fixed elections, and the suppression of personal freedoms. The Truman Doctrine was first applied in giving political and military aid to Greece and Turkey. But Truman stressed overall the new international position for the United States. In the absence of an effective United Nations, America was the one nation capable of defending freedom and establishing peace. This is no more than a frank recognition that totalitarian regimes imposed upon free peoples by direct or indirect aggression undermine the foundations of international peace, and hence the security of the United States, said Truman. He underscored that a primary objective of Cold War policy was to create conditions in which the United States and other nations worked out a way of life free from coercion. While no government was perfect, he added, one of the chief virtues of a democracy is that its defects are always visible and under democratic processes can be pointed out and corrected. The Truman Doctrine and containment generally could promote democracy by defending the conditions necessary for freedom. This understanding of the Cold War infused Truman's resolve and his policies. The institutions and arrangements that resulted, especially, but not only, the Truman Doctrine itself, that's slide 5, the Marshall Plan, that's slide 6 and 7, and the North Atlantic Treaty, soon to be NATO, slide 8, undergirded American foreign policy for much of the Cold War and the post-Cold War era. And maybe we can talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A. The United States and its allies needed to build up their strength. Because of what he thought, said, and did, Stalin was not to be trusted, accommodated, or negotiated with. If the United States negotiated one day with the Soviet Union, it could only be from a position of strength. The loss of freedom anywhere was a loss of freedom everywhere. And these points were all accepted and appreciated by Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson. Indeed, until the tragic quagmire of Vietnam, Truman's containment, with some variations along the way, was every president's approach. That brings us to the second stage of containment, and that is détente. For the West, détente meant a relaxation of tensions between the free world and the communist world. For their part, the communists interpreted détente much differently. Détente came about in part because of US defense and domestic spending decisions and their effect on the economy, the Vietnam War, an ongoing Soviet military buildup, and nuclear parity between the superpowers. The symmetry that began in the mid-1950s in the Eisenhower era and continued under John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson became a full-fledged commitment to arms control treaties. The détente presidents, from Richard Nixon through Jimmy Carter, shared the expectation that the Soviets would honor arms control treaties and respond with moderation in their own military spending and actions. So détente is grounded fundamentally in removing the regime distinction and seeing and seeking peace in a vacuum. Against the backdrop of the gold and glitter of the great Kremlin palace in Moscow, President Nixon, slide 9, once the poster child for a cold warrior. And if you see here after the slide of Nixon, there's one of him from the 1950s, which shows him at the height of being this cold warrior. But in the 1970s, in 1972, he gave this internationally televised address as president from the Kremlin. Here, Nixon said, "There can be true peace only when the weak are as safe as the strong," he said. Containment had sought to block further communist gains and to plant the seeds for the weakening and reversal of communism. By contrast, détente accepted and legitimated communism as a political system on equal footing with liberal democracy. Nixon hoped that the communists would moderate their behavior if they were made to feel safe. If we did not want peace, he said, we would not have worked so hard at reaching an agreement on the limitation of nuclear arms, at achieving a settlement of Berlin, at maintaining peace in the Middle East, at establishing better relations with the Soviet Union, with the People's Republic of China, with other nations of the world. By making the Soviets and then the Chinese comfortable and equal partners in diplomacy, Nixon hoped to settle the Cold War and replace it with standard great power, balance of power politics. He started with a drawdown in Vietnam and a drastic drop in defense spending there and elsewhere. And then he concentrated on triangular diplomacy with respect to the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. And the next two slides show the two leaders of those countries that he dealt with. That's Brezhnev and that's Mao Zedong. But détente ended up giving cover to the communists. The Soviets had already commenced their support of wars of national liberation under Nikita Khrushchev long before détente. The Cold War was already global and on all fronts before Nixon's election. Détente, Western style, sought to establish stability and safety, but its proponents did not realize that the communists still wanted victory, that the communists believed that what they called the correlation of forces was on their side, and that, again, what they referred to as peaceful coexistence meant advancing world socialism through every means short of direct war between the superpowers. Jimmy Carter, slide 13, retained from détente the notion that the United States should strive for stability and strategic parity with the Soviets, and added that nuclear annihilation posed the worst possible threat. He pursued the next round of SALT talks, and he also stressed world order issues and human rights, and aimed to bypass the Cold War by declaring that the West was now free of what he called an inordinate fear of communism. Carter continued Nixon's tilt toward China. Carter diplomatically recognized the People's Republic of China and de-recognized America's official ally, the Republic of China, or Taiwan. In the developing world, as communists advanced in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, Carter identified poverty rather than ideology as the real problem. Indeed, he really thought that the Cold War was a problem that was mostly restricted to Europe. Now, what were the results of détente? On the plus side, dissidents behind the iron and bamboo curtains took seriously the meaning of the Helsinki Accords in 1975 and other pro-freedom statements in the West, and made heroic, sustained efforts to criticize and weaken communism from within. Meanwhile, many in the West became versed in a rich language of human rights that upholds the dignity of the individual and free, open, democratic governments. But the negative dominated. It is especially instructive to look at détente from the communist perspective. Taking the détente era as a whole, from Nixon through Carter, the communists define the relaxation of tensions in this way. The Cultural Revolution continued to rage in the People's Republic of China. The Soviets signed a friendship pact with India and made inroads into the non-aligned world. The Soviets signed the SALT I and ABM treaties and proceeded to violate the terms. Communists took over Ethiopia, Cambodia, Vietnam, Angola, Mozambique, and Laos. The Soviet Union signed the Helsinki Accords and then proceeded to violate them, while getting their post-World War II borders legitimized and also receiving various trade benefits out of the deal. Jews in the Soviet Empire were neither allowed to worship nor allowed to leave for Israel and elsewhere. The Kremlin deployed SS-20 missiles that could reach targets in Western Europe. The communists seized power in Afghanistan. The Soviets signed the SALT II agreement and then proceeded to violate that treaty. Communists took power in Nicaragua. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, starting a 10-year war there. The communists supported and funded large portions of the nuclear freeze movement. And it goes on. These are just the highlights. That brings us to the third stage of containment, which is the renewal of containment. Ronald Reagan, next slide, please, believed that détente was fundamentally flawed and that the communists had exploited it whenever and wherever possible. If anything, he thought détente helped the communists and thus perpetuated the Cold War. In his pre-presidential speeches, radio addresses, and other writings, Reagan had already put forth a serious critique of what was not working and how the communists still believed in the spread of their totalitarian ideology and the power and influence of their empire. By the time he became president, Reagan understood that the Soviets were still communists who were committed to world revolution. At the same time, though, Reagan saw that there were serious weaknesses within the Soviet empire. Under the circumstances of the 1980s, Reagan took what had been stated, though not fully enacted, by Truman and his immediate successors, and carried containment to its logical conclusion. Based on the intelligence reports that he was receiving as president and his lifelong study, Reagan concluded that Soviet communism was cracking and ready to crumble. There are many Reagan speeches and statements that can help you understand his approach. President Reagan's June 1982 address to the British Parliament is a good place to start. There he said that the Soviet Union was gripped by a great revolutionary crisis and that a global campaign for freedom would ultimately prevail. In what was unthinkable at the time, he then predicted that the march of freedom and democracy will leave Marxism-Leninism on the ash heap of history, as it has left other tyrannies which stifle the freedom and muzzle the self-expression of the people. This same speech is filled with substantive analysis and policy direction. Main Reagan themes are present, including about the Soviet Union's economic difficulties and its steep decline compared to itself in the 1950s and relative to the current day in the 1980s. The Soviet Union is not immune from the reality of what is going on in the world, said Reagan. It has happened in the past. A small ruling elite either mistakenly attempts to ease domestic unrest through greater repression and foreign adventure, or it chooses a wiser course. It begins to allow its people a voice in their own destiny. He suggested that the United States, and more broadly the West, would craft and pursue policies to push the Soviet Union into a wiser course. Reagan did not just speak these words, he acted on them. He directed his national security team to develop a plan to end the Cold War by winning it. He did not know the outcome, but he said trying to win the Cold War should be the frame of reference. From that plan came a multifaceted foreign policy that included covert support of the Solidarity movement in Poland, an increase in pro-freedom public diplomacy, This was building on the Voice of America that already existed, and Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty and other radio stations, and then adding the National Endowment for Democracy. So public diplomacy is very important. A global campaign to reduce Soviet access to Western high technology. Again, think about that, trying to block technology. And an effort to hurt the Soviet economy by driving down the price of oil and limiting natural gas exports to the West. This foreign policy also supported anti-communist forces in Afghanistan, Nicaragua, Angola, and Cambodia. This became known as the Reagan Doctrine. And the Reagan Doctrine resulted in a Soviet pullout from Afghanistan, the election of a democratic government in Nicaragua, and the removal of 40,000 Cuban troops from Angola, and the holding of UN-monitored elections there. This foreign policy also included the Strategic Defense Initiative, known as SDI to its supporters, and Star Wars by skeptics. This was ballistic missile defense, and a lot of people thought it couldn't happen. And Reagan said the technology can be there, and it can also get us out of the nuclear problem. So SDI, even though it wasn't fully made and implemented at the time in the 1980s, forced the Soviets to realize that they could not compete technologically with the United States, and that Reagan was actually committed to neutralizing the nuclear threat. Then this multi-pronged strategy was enacted with great timing. Reagan saw the political, economic, and moral rot at the core of the Soviet Union. It was really only a superpower at this point because of its military, including nuclear power, and its natural resources. Reagan pointed out the rot, and he built up American and Western strength of all kinds. And if that sounds familiar, that's because it was, because he was going back to the Truman version of containment and then completing it and talking about peace through strength. And that's something that, again, we see as very important throughout the best foreign policies of the Cold War in the United States. And then from that position of strength, Reagan met with the Soviets. As he entered these diplomatic waters, he often said, "Trust but verify." And he found that he was able to do so with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. That's the next slide. Reagan quipped that he would have met with Gorbachev's predecessors, but they kept dying on him. And this is another what if of history. What if Gorbachev's predecessors had not kept dying on Reagan? So Reagan knew that he could deal with Gorbachev in part because of what he had been doing, the United States had been doing, the West had been doing, NATO had been doing. He had been getting information from other leaders about how to talk with Gorbachev. But then Gorbachev had to be different, not because he wanted to change the USSR. Ultimately, he was different because he had to change the USSR. He had to change the Soviet Union because of what was going on. Gorbachev thought he could allow just a little political openness, but in so doing, he was forced to change, and his government, a communist, totalitarian regime, and an empire of captive nations, was forced to change, and in a relatively short time, collapsed. You should now have a general sense of the Cold War. You might ask, when did it end? In history classes, you're used to specific dates for beginnings and endings. The ending of the Cold War is not one specific date. It really goes from 1989 through 1991. This period is the coda to the history covered in this talk. At VOC, the organization where I'm on the board, we refer to 1989 as the year of miracles throughout Europe. Many people and their actions are responsible for this year of miracles that really took decades in the making. It is vividly represented in the Berlin Wall coming down, and as you'll see in this slide, being taken down in November of that year. For the next 2 years, the Soviet communists tried to hold on in an increasingly smaller area, including using armed force in the Baltic states. But at Christmas time, 1991, the Soviet Union was forced to collapse, and its unelected communist president resigned. And the next slide shows you some of the protests going on to get rid of the Soviet Union and to create Russia as an independent, non-communist state. Democratic at the time, hard to believe, right? On June 4th, 1989, the Chinese Communist Party and its People's Liberation Army killed thousands of peaceful protesters, many of them students not much older than you, in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. That's the next slide. While the Cold War between the United States and its allies and the USSR and its captive nations came to an end, communism did not end. So at VOC, we refer to 1989 as the year of miracles and tears. And more than 1.5 billion people still live under communist regimes today. And for that history, as well as more about the Cold War, I invite your questions now, but I also invite you to visit us at the Victims of Communism Museum in Washington, DC, which is opening this summer. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Elizabeth. That was very enlightening. I really enjoyed it as usual. A couple questions. So we'll start at the very beginning of the Cold War. So we just had World War II, the greatest, at the time, the greatest catastrophe that the world really had ever seen as far as conflict goes, the greatest loss of life. But yet right after that, we seem to fall into what we call the Cold War. So was the Cold War inevitable after given what everybody thought we were going to have a new dawning of peace now that the threat of fascism was gone? So what's your take on that? Was it inevitable and why?
Right. That is a question for the ages. It's often asked. And I don't think it was inevitable, but as we would say in Washington, it was baked in the cake in some ways because of what was going on, frankly, in World War II and even before. So as a lot of our viewers will know from their history classes, there were these wartime agreements during World War II. And so some things about the Cold War were already taking shape even then. And in order to have the Soviets as allies against the Nazis, the West, what would become known as the West, what was already the West, but especially the Americans and the British, agreed to certain things that would then let the Soviets, including their Red Army, take over parts of Eastern Europe and Central Europe, and continue to have the Baltics as they, were liberating. I kept orphan quotes, liberating during World War II. And so this is something where the West, and by the time you're coming out of World War II, this would include everybody that had been liberated that didn't want to be a communist. They would have had to all say, we are ready to take on the communists. We're ready to take on the Soviet Union. And I think a lot of countries weren't seeing what was developing. In some places, the Soviets were just leaving their army parked there. In other places, they were pretty sly about taking over different parts of the governments of these Eastern and Central European countries. And in still other places, they were saying, well, this is just reparations. Well, actually, everywhere they were saying, this is just reparations for what we suffered during World War II. And so we should be allowed to, take these materials, help this government shape this way. And then they started to commit more and more actual fraud, election fraud, other types of fraud. And before you turn around, you're into 1947, and countries are now becoming permanently communist, that the Soviets have engineered it, and not everybody understood that. Some people understood it, but not everybody did. And the thing that really shocked the West, that woke up a lot of people, if they hadn't been woken up by something like Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain address in 1946, or the need for the Truman Doctrine starting in 1947, or the need for the Marshall Plan announced in 1947 and starting by the end of that year in 1948, was the coup in Czechoslovakia, which we call the Czech coup, in 1948 February. And that one, because out of all the remaining Eastern and Central European countries, Czechoslovakia was the only one that had not gone communist yet, and had some communists in its government had said, that's okay, we can be multi-party, everybody can get along. It was a everybody can get along kind of feeling.
Right.
And then it was an actual communist coup. There was a death, a murder really, of a main leader of the opposition involved, and other horrible things. And Czechoslovakia joined then, against its will, the East Bloc, the Soviet bloc. So then people knew they really had the Cold War. So that's a long answer to your question, but you cannot just jump to 1940s after World War II. You have to include World War II. And if we had even more time, we'd of course go back. And then if you're looking at the regime question, did it matter that the Soviet Union became the Soviet Union as a dedicated communist state to trying to make other states communist, right? Yes. So that means that, you can go back to 1917 in some ways to then talk about why do you have the Cold War and whether it was inevitable.
Okay, good answer. So kind of building on that. So we had the fall, basically, or not really the fall, but the capturing of Eastern Europe by the Soviets, them never leaving. And then we started to see this walk of communism across other parts in Europe, trying to go south a little bit toward Greece. Then we see it spreading to Asia with China. Then we have the Korean War, the Vietnam, and then we have this thing that becomes known as a domino theory. So what's your view on that? So how did this come to be known, and what was that a valid fear on the West of this thing called the domino theory?
Right. Many students will find that in textbooks and other sources, the domino theory is poo-pooed. It is dismissed. Oh my gosh, this was an excessive reaction on the part of especially Dwight Eisenhower and his administration. And you had that, Eisenhower and especially his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, who were just into rollback and they wanted to do too much. But if you look at what the domino theory really meant, that if these communist countries were allowed to continue, if they continued, they would keep going if they could go. And it is true that the spread of communism went into Asia. And some of that's, again, because of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is why you have Korea split coming out of World War II, and why you get a North Korea before 1950, when North Korea invades South Korea and starts the Korean War. China is having a civil war between the communists and the anti-communists for decades. And World War II is wrapped up in that. In Asia, you can't separate that. And a lot of American students have no understanding of that. And so it was something that was already starting to spread. And then at times the communists did fight during World War II, but often they let the nationalists, the anti-communists, the non-communists fight their battles for them. And then they were waiting so that they could be as strong as they possibly could be coming out of World War II so they could spread communism. At this point, when the domino theory comes online in the 1950s, the Chinese communists and the Soviet communists are on the same page most of the time. There's not been a split between them. And of course, we must understand that when there's a split between communists, each side is still communist. It's just that they split from each other. It wasn't as if each group of communists stopped being communists. So then you have actually, in some ways, the Soviets are still trying to promote communism, and the Chinese communists are trying to promote communism. They do it in their respective ways. Sometimes they're supporting the same parties. Sometimes they're supporting opposite parties. That's domino theory too, because you're creating more communism. And so it's a thumbnail sketch way of referring to something that actually has a lot of truth to it.
Okay, good. So, and we talk about the domino theory being poo-pooed. Then you have this kind of this debate throughout our history in the historical community about the Cold War. Well, whose fault was it? Was it the U.S. or I'm sorry, was it the Soviets? Were they the ones who really brought this on? Then you have this transition to where it could be a little bit of both, or that it could be, some folks who actually believe it's maybe been the US's fault because we overreacted. And some of the same things you're seeing now with why did Putin invade Ukraine? Was it because NATO encroached on his border, or was there something else going on in the system that brought that about? So what's your take on that?
Right. So there are, so many academics, so many debates, so many schools of thought. There are four main schools of thought on the Cold War, and I'm not going to bore our audience with them right now, but just in form, one argues that the Soviet Union was at fault. The next one argues that the United States was at fault. The third one argues that both are kind of at fault and there was a lot of misunderstanding. And the fourth one argues in a combination as well, but basically says the United States was more at fault than the Soviet Union if you're looking at it from economic, strategic point of view, but the Soviets were kind of a problem in some ways, but they could have been better. Throughout all of that, there's also some people will make a defense of communism and say it just wasn't done right, and that the Soviets, if they could have done it differently, it would have been done. That one, watch our Communism 101 lecture and some of the other talks that we've done for Streamable Learning through VOC, and you'll get the real truth about how communism isn't something that has just not been tried right. It's problematic from the start. So we can set that one aside. And as a result, that means that if you're talking about fault in the Cold War, the Soviets are at fault because they're communist, right? They're trying to impose something. They're trying to change human nature. They don't accept that human beings are what they are. And then they don't believe in representative government. They don't believe, and I go back to on this one, I mean, again, we don't have time for 3 hours of conversation on this, but Winston Churchill famously said that democracy was the worst form of government except for every other. And that's paraphrasing, but this is the case where we're not perfect. And it's part of the reason I read from the Truman Doctrine speech, because Truman said the defects of democracy are always visible and you can correct them. And that's the difference between democracy and other types of regimes. So we know we're not perfect, but we can fix ourselves. But a totalitarian regime, a communist regime, is one that it always serves the party, it always serves the state. And it's not looking to change, it's looking to impose, it's looking to say we're inevitable and it's got to be the way we say. So from the regime perspective, from the human nature perspective, and then also from how that sets it up in world politics perspective, the Soviets are much more at fault, and I would say they are at fault. I think that the United States is reacting, and so these are good policies of containment, as I've gone through to explain in the Cold War, especially in that early period where you have things like the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, NATO, the public diplomacy that was done at that time, other policies. All of that's very important, but so much of it is reacting to what the Soviets have already done, frankly, before World War II, during World War II, and then immediately after World War II.
Okay, and just one last question before we close, and it goes back to the last leader you spoke about, which let's talk about Reagan. So Reagan, what did he see that other leaders before him didn't? He came about with this, we had containment, we'd had the taunt. Now we're going to win the Cold War. So what was different about Reagan? What did he see that the other leaders before him didn't see?
Right. You know how sometimes you hope that you're doing what you were meant to be put on earth to do? Right. So with Reagan, he could have been president earlier than he ended up being president, or he might have never become president because he could have just stuck with what he was doing in acting, public speaking, business, other areas. But he ended up as president at this time, elected in 1980. It's a critical time in the Cold War, and you have some encouraging things happening behind the Iron Curtain, very much including solidarity in Poland, which was the first trade union under communism, and so it was non-communist, anti-communist in it, and they were pushing hard. And you had this newish Pope, John Paul II, who happened to come from Poland, and he was supporting all of this. And he and Reagan and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher of Britain and some others all are leaders at the same time. So he has community of believers within the West about what the Cold War means. But Reagan, he had made this lifelong study really of communism and why it was wrong. And he started seeing some weaknesses. And it was long before he was president that he saw that the economic weakness was there and then was increasing. And in the 1970s, he really started to probe this notion that although the Soviet Union appeared like a completely impervious superpower on the outside, it actually had these problems on the inside. And then he saw all sorts of problems. He saw the economic problem. He saw that they were starting to have problems, that they had never been as advanced economically as they pretended to be. But then he also saw the political problems because he didn't believe in their understanding of human nature and the regime and politics, right? And then he saw that they had a moral problem as a result, and that human beings do want to believe in something, or actually believe in something. They realize there's some self-evident truth beyond them, and that God shouldn't be stamped out. And then he also realized that militarily, although they had huge advantages in a lot of things in conventional, including army, men, just like too many men in the army. But they had worked hard to gain more and more of a nuclear component, that even that could be pressed if America used its strengths like the technology. That's why I made a big deal about that in the talk. And so it's kind of the combination of all of that. And then he was willing not to accept the status quo. I'm amazed in the study of the presidency and frankly, other statesmen in other countries, how often you see somebody just accepting the status quo. And Reagan said, I don't know that I'm going to succeed, but I'm going to try. And then, as you said, this notion of we win, they lose, he said, what if we just reframe everything we're doing in US foreign policy, in containment, and start with this premise that we can actually win. We can pressure the Soviets and win, not cause a World War III, but win the Cold War.
Okay, I think we do have time for one more question. It just, what is, if you had to describe one thing, what would be the one thing that you would tell the folks viewing this class that they need, the most important thing they need to understand about the Cold War?
Ken, that's a really important one. I would say that it's important to realize that it was actually a war. It was actually an international conflict, that the stakes, it's one big long one, and that the stakes were big. They were truly life and death. It all could have been different. This was not something that would have just worked itself out. And I think that high school students in particular need to understand that this was as big as any other big event that you've studied in history. And it could have been far different. And the United States, not perfect by any stretch, but it committed for decades, I mean, by the time you add it all up, it's really over 45 years. I know I said over 40 years, but if you're including the last part of World War II and on from there, it's really 2 lifetimes, 2 generations of fighting this.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think that's a good answer. A lot of good discussion there, and I think as a young Army officer over there at the tail end of the Cold War, it was what we lived and breathed every day. I mean, you could see it. All you had to do was drive a few kilometers from where we lived, and you could see the fence that divided East and West. So it was definitely a real thing. So again, thank you so much for your perspective on this. It's a great class, and I really always learn something every time we do one of these with you. Ellie, I'd like to, if you could, to put up that last slide so we can talk about an event coming up. So if you'd like to learn more about what Dr. Spalding spoke about today, communism in general, the theory behind it, especially if you're a teacher, then we have an opportunity for you. This summer, July 18 through 22, as you see on the slide, we're hosting our National Seminar for Middle and High School Teachers, where we teach teachers and discuss with teachers how to talk about and how to teach communism from theory all the way up to present day China. It's free. It gives you 24 hours of professional development credit toward your requirements for your professional education, but also for promotions and salary increases. So if you'd like to join us for that, please reach out at that number or that email or that website address, and you will be walked through how to register for the class. Again, it's free of charge. It takes place here in DC at our new museum, as Elizabeth mentioned, that will open up on the 13th of June for the public. So we hope to see you at both of those very soon. So again, thank you for joining us. And this has been brought to you by the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and Streamable Learning, and look forward to seeing you next semester. Thanks.